Good morning. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for having us. As she mentioned, my name is Molly Zametkin, and I am currently working at the Northstar Academy in Rockville, Maryland, which is a day program for children and adolescents who have mental health and substance abuse issues. So I'm a primary therapist there, so I'm administering individual and group therapy on a weekly basis with a variety of types of students who are facing a bunch of different difficulties, but very commonly ADHD. So I want to start by explaining to you guys a little bit about what the social work perspective is on mental health, particularly in the realm of ADHD. So when it comes to ADHD and children with ADHD, we have two lines of thinking. The first is a common social work creed or mantra that we work by is meeting the client where they're at. So with ADHD, that means taking a really individualized perspective on each student that we're working with, considering their specific needs, the specific accommodations they will need, but recognizing that every kid is like a snowflake and they're all really different, they have different needs, and accommodating them in that realm. And then the second social work perspective that I really like to take when it comes to treating children and adolescents with ADHD is thinking very specifically about the child or adolescent, the ADHD learner, in their environment. So not just thinking about their personal sets of behaviors, their personal sets of accommodations, but also thinking broadly about their reciprocal relationship to their environment. Now, the adolescent with ADHD is going to be particularly impacted by their environment, and I'm going to go into that in more detail in the presentation. But it is really also important to be thinking about systems around the ADHD learner. So their family system, their school system, their social support system. These are all things that as a social worker I'm thinking about when I'm treating a kid with ADHD. So before we get started, I'm wondering if I could get a show of hands from you guys. Who here is a teacher? Okay. Who's a parent? Okay. How about clinicians or people working in agencies with people with ADHD? Okay, great. I should mention, we are going to do question and answer at the end. So if you guys have questions, hold them. But if I go too fast or I'm not loud enough, just raise your hand. So I'll get started. So what is ADHD? You guys probably know this because you have a coworker with ADHD. You may have a child with ADHD. You yourself may have ADHD. But ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by executive functioning and impulse control deficits. This looks like a lack of focus, fidgeting, difficulty staying seated, overactive personality, forgetfulness, talking out of turn, interrupting, behavioral problems, and impulsiveness. And again, if you're in this lecture, you probably know a little bit about ADHD. You guys may not be able to see the labels on this slide, but I just wanted to have this slide in here to remind me to mention that years and years of research on ADHD has really helped us establish that there are fundamental significant changes and differences in the brain of an ADHD adolescent compared to, I hate this word, but compared to a normal child. What we're seeing, and you guys may have heard a little bit about this in other lectures, is that the front of the brain is acting sort of differently in the ADHD child, and that can lead to issues such as, like I mentioned, impulse control, difficulties with inhibition. And that idea is getting at this buzzword in the field of research around ADHD right now, which is executive functioning. And both me and my dad are going to be hitting on that several points throughout this lecture. So again, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and poor inhibition. What does this look like? What am I seeing in my day-to-day practice with adolescents and children who have ADHD? I'm seeing impaired verbal and motor inhibition, the motor mouth, the kid who can't stop fidgeting at their desk, they can't stop playing with things or picking at things, or even just sitting still on their desk. They're constantly adjusting, not making eye contact. In some ways, their inability to sort of stay on task and initiate tasks and behaviors is impaired by this excessive need to talk and to move. In addition, impulsive decision making, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about, but that disconnect between I'm thinking before I'm acting, or I'm thinking before I'm making a decision. Also, a disregard of consequences, and this isn't true across the board. We're not seeing this with every single kid with ADHD. Some kids, it's important, really important to note that some children with ADHD are really sensitive to consequences, whereas some are more sensitive and receptive to positive rewards. So to accommodate the ADHD learner, it's really important outright to determine which your child or your client or your student is going to be more receptive to, consequences or positive rewards. Again, a little bit more about the symptoms. The excessive irrelevant movement and verbal behavior, I sort of explained that in the last slide. But you will commonly find that the ADHD child will get fascinated with things that are just not pertinent in the moment. That they really want to fixate on perhaps like the more interesting or the more fun component of a group activity or an individual activity. Also, emotional impulsivity and poor emotional self-regulation. So again, that's coming into play with this sort of disconnect between thinking and acting. It also means disconnect between thinking and feeling. And again, restlessness. This is a huge component. The ADHD child is going to have trouble sitting still. So inattention looks like, from the social work perspective, again, poor persistence towards goals. So the ADHD child really has difficulty in the learning realm with looking at a long-term goal. So saying, okay, I'm starting the semester, I have X amount of time to do X amount of assignments, and between now and then I'm going to have to achieve all these little mile markers. It's really difficult for them to think long-term, to plan long-term, and to persist towards their goals. That impaired resistance to responding to a distraction, so the shiny object in the corner of the room is particularly fascinating to the ADHD child. The fish tank at the back of the classroom. Sort of conveniently, whatever is not the meat of the material may be more fascinating to the ADHD child and learner. Task re-engagement refers to once a child with ADHD has gotten off task. So once the shiny object in the corner of the room has caught their attention, they're going to have difficulty, and it may take them a while. It's not impossible, but it's going to take longer for the ADHD child to get back into whatever they're supposed to be doing. Also, impaired working memory. This has been discussed in some of the other lectures, but impaired working memory looks like remembering so as to do. So going back to that idea of poor persistence towards goals. They may not be able to, or they may have a deficiency or just an impairment, or again, every child is individual, this may not be their issue, but what we're seeing a lot of is impaired working memory, so remembering and planning and setting goals so as to complete a task later on. I don't like this slide. As a social worker, again, I'm taking a very individualized and environmentally informed perspective on my kids, and I think it's sort of dangerous and controversial to talk about the causes of ADHD. We know our research really confirms that there is an extremely strong genetic component to ADHD. There's no question about that, but we're also looking at things like brain injuries, lead exposure, cigarette and alcohol exposure during pregnancy, stroke, and concussion. And the sort of more controversial area of discussion around causes for ADHD is nutrition. You guys may have heard diet can contribute to ADHD. I have a little bit of trouble with that, but I will say this. I don't think nutrition causes ADHD. I think that in disenfranchised communities, prenatal mothers' nutrition can have an impact on ADHD developing, but again, it's kind of a blurrier area. But we do know there is some suggestions within the research that the way a child with ADHD eats can impact their behavior. So, the question of the hour. How does ADHD impact learning? Again, I'm going to be coming at this from a social work perspective. So, What that means for me is I want to provide you guys with resources for what you do if you have an ADHD client, child, sibling, coworker, whatever the case may be. So first off, again, this idea of executive functioning. This is the big buzzword in ADHD research and treatment right now. Executive functioning refers to inhibition, planning, metacognition, which refers to thinking about thinking. So how am I thinking? How are you thinking? Again, going into the idea of planning, long-term thinking. And then sort of the question is executive functioning deficiency unique to ADHD? If your doctor says your child is struggling with executive functioning, does that mean your child has ADHD? The answer is no. We see executive functioning impairment in a variety of other conditions, and we do see, again, an association with the morphology and the physiology of the brain, specifically the front half of the brain. So on the left of the next several slides, you're going to see what a teacher would say, or what a teacher would be seeing, or perhaps a parent might see. ADHD disrupts behavioral inhibition and executive functioning. So what does that look like in the ADHD learner? Time management difficulties, again, planning, impulse control, learning how to structure their day, how much time to spend on a certain activity before moving on. Also, organization and problem solving. For those of you who are ADHD children's parents, this may really resonate with you because perhaps your child has the really messy binder, the really messy locker, for older adolescents, the messy car, the messy room. When I was growing up, my dad used to make jokes about how instantaneously I could trash a room with little to no effort. And now as an adult, I've learned that one of my primary coping mechanisms is staying exhaustively organized. So my apartment, my car, my desk are very meticulously organized so as to prevent distractions. I also really intensely my whole life have used a planner, which when I was younger and I was very forgetful and less organized, I'd forget at places, I would lose it, but now I know that my planner is my Bible. Activation and concentration as well as motivation across time. The ADHD child will have some difficulties with motivation, which is why it's particularly important to look at things like sensitivity to consequences versus positive rewards, because the ADHD child is very motivatable, but they themselves have difficulty with activation, so getting started with an activity, and then concentration, so staying engaged. The ADHD child appears to be spacing out during lessons. This idea sort of speaks to the importance of differential diagnosis, because sometimes internal distraction can look like ADHD, whereas it's actually anxiety. So internal distraction, worrying or ruminating about things that are not pertinent to the current lesson or the current day or the present moment, that can be anxiety. So getting a concrete differential diagnosis, concretely determining your child's symptom sets, can really be helpful for this idea of spacing out. When we see a kid spacing out, we're thinking, okay, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's ADHD. The ADHD learner is going to be missing directions. They may need specific accommodations that provides them with written directions, or the accommodation to go to the teacher and ask for elaboration on directions. The ADHD child may not have the motivation to go to the teacher on their own, so putting a support in place for them can be really helpful. Again, frequently forgetting items. This is a hugely impairing issue for children with ADHD because sometimes they're not prepared for the lesson. Perhaps they're ready to be attentive, but they've forgotten their binder, or they've forgotten their protractor, or they've forgotten their assignment for the night. They left it at home, or they have an excuse, the dog ate it, whatever the case may be. They may not be prepared for lessons. And again, there is a chance that they will need exhaustively directions repeated or written out for them, and providing that accommodation can be really helpful. So the ADHD child will start an assignment and then be unable to complete it. Again, this idea of task, engagement, activation, concentration, staying with the assignment that they're supposed to be working on rather than nudging their buddy in class or thinking about what's going to happen at the end of the day or the fun plans for this weekend. They're going to be really easily distracted by their peers. I think it's pretty rare that we see an ADHD child who would describe as shy. They're typically very social and outgoing, but not in all cases. Again, the snowflake perspective on children, they're all different. But we are commonly seeing the excessive talking, which leads to excessive socialization and therefore being distracted by their peers in class. They may be able to participate in a group, but commonly they will activate, begin to concentrate, begin to engage, but then slowly drift off and find something that they like better, which means fixating, again, on irrelevant tasks. So the ADHD child is always going to be talking, so again, hyper-verbal, almost sometimes like driven by a motor, like really wanting to chat, really wanting to ask questions, maybe having questions that are totally irrelevant, comments that are totally irrelevant. In groups, I see this a lot. The ADHD learner will share stories that aren't necessarily relevant, or they'll really want to talk about themselves or their day, really excited and engaged by that material, but not necessarily on task or on topic. Which then leads to, which I see a lot, is irritation from other kids. Which again, thinking about the way the ADHD learner is having a reciprocal relationship with their environment, the ADHD learner's self-esteem is going to be impacted by the fact that they have difficulty controlling themselves and controlling their urge to talk. They're going to bug their peers sometimes. And that can be really difficult when they start to catch on about it, that they're sort of annoying people. So bolstering the self-esteem is a really important way to provide supports to the ADHD learner. Again, trouble getting to the point. So great stories, great imagination, a lot of times really bright and brilliant, but just sort of missing the point of the assignment or missing the point of whatever it is that they're sharing in the moment. The ADHD child may not work well in groups. Again, argumentative, distractive, or distracting, distracted. And then, unfortunately, we do sort of see this increase in bullying behavior, again, which may be linked to self-esteem. They may attempt to distract other kids in groups by, teasing or using what we call at Northstar hurtful humor. And again, it's the inhibition thing. They're not really thinking before they're speaking or thinking before they act. Some ADHD kids are better at that. It's not generalizable across the board. Not all kids with ADHD are bullies, and I hate to think that way, but we do see a little bit of a spike in that type of behavior. So, again, social work perspective, thinking about how I can help you guys, how I can provide you guys with resources and thinking in this area. If you have the ADHD child, the ADHD learner, the ADHD client, the ADHD coworker, sibling, whatever the case is, what can you do? So, I've broken this down into 2 slides that I'll provide you guys with some resources. First and foremost, learning about ADHD. You're here, so you're doing that. Number 2, paying really close attention to behavior. This may sound like simple or rudimentary or basic, but to provide resources to your child or client, it's really important to be thinking about being the researcher, observing a lot of their behaviors, asking a lot of questions of school resources, the counselor, going to your child's best friend's mom and saying, hey, when they come over and play at your house, like what are you seeing in my kid's behavior? Talking to the teacher, talking to the babysitter, collecting information about what their behavior looks like in different environments. My dad would tell you that in all of his years, his 30 years of looking at kids with ADHD, one of the most implicative resources that you can look to is your child's report card and the feedback from teachers. So those comments like your kid is frequently out of their desk, your kid is talking a lot, your kid is disrupting others, your kid has difficulty with task engagement or task recognition, things like that. But again, being the researcher, getting really active and involved in your child's behavior in the different environments, including in your home. Find out what's happening at school. This is a no-brainer. Talk to teachers. Talk to the school counselor. Go talk to the principal. If your kid is getting in trouble a fair amount, figure out what's going on. Talking to your child's doctor, pretty obvious. This is the way that you would get a referral to a psychiatrist. So in the case that you do need a medication for your child, this is the first stop. And then consulting with specialists. So in 2016, we have the privilege of ADHD coaches, ADHD mentors, people like my dad who have been studying and doing research for a really long time and have a really broad spectrum understanding of what this symptom set looks like. Working closely with your child's school, I went over that, but also getting an evaluation. So again, the differential diagnosis, figuring out concretely, is this ADHD, is this anxiety, is this ODD, is this OCD? Teasing out some of these conditions that can kind of look similar is really important, and that starts with getting an evaluation. Earlier we had an excellent presentation about processing speed. That's another sort of feature that can look like ADHD or can be comorbid with ADHD, and it's important to be considering those different symptom sets very closely. That comes with an evaluation in the school, an evaluation maybe by a psychiatrist or by an occupational therapist, someone who can give your adolescent, your ADHD learner a variety of tests that can really inform you concretely about what's going on. Meeting with the school to discuss services. Again, you're gonna have to do a lot of work. You're gonna have to be the observer, the researcher, and the advocate to get services put in place for your ADHD learner. So that may mean 504, IEP, basic environmental accommodations. Sometimes it doesn't need to be a formal thing. The luxury of a kid that goes to a school like McLean is they may be willing to work with you to put some special accommodations in place to support your learner. And then finally, investigating and investing in treatment and therapies. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but early intervention is so critical. So getting on board early with a therapist, maybe an ADHD coach or mentor. But if you're seeing, if you're seeing these signs in your ADHD child, if you're seeing early on, early elementary school, you're seeing that inattention, the hyperactivity, the poor inhibition, investing early. Looking at these things early, getting the supports in place early on will significantly improve your outcome of your ADHD learner. And like I said, I'll get into that a little bit more. So what are the implications for ADHD and learning? Broadly, medication may be requisite. Skills or coping mechanisms may not be enough. It's possible that the ADHD learner will need a pharmacological intervention to really boost motivation, boost attention. So skills are great, coping mechanisms great, accommodations great, but may need to consider medication. And my dad is going to be talking about that extensively in his presentation. So if you guys have questions, he's your man on that. Also, environmental accommodations, so things like providing a quiet, non-distracting environment can be really good. In the public school setting, and I can say in a boutique program like the one that I work at, this is not always possible due to coverage, due to amount of staff on board. It's not always possible to put a kid in a quiet room by themselves. But this can be particularly helpful at home, thinking about away from the TV, away from siblings, away from the kitchen where you may be engaged with other things that might distract them. This last one's really important, and I love this one. The ADHD child needs to be held accountable. Yes, they have difficulties with impulse control. Yes, they have difficulties with inhibition, task re-engagement, but it's not impossible for them. This does not mean they are incapable of these things. It requires practice and supports, environmental supports. So holding the ADHD child accountable for their behavior is really requisite for them developing the skills that later on in life, when they're an adult, will really provide them with the successes and the career paths that they want to be on. Considerations. I don't think, in my personal opinion, in my personal experience, holding back the ADHD learner really is not going to do what you think it's going to do. This can damage self-esteem and stigmatize the ADHD learner. I'm against it. In some cases, it can be good, but in my experience, it can be more detrimental than beneficial. I do really like, however, decreasing the total workload. I think in a perfect world, ADHD kids wouldn't have to do homework. They would come home after being at school and they would be able to go out and play and run around. But that's, again, a perfect world. So what we want is to first target productivity. So giving them the A+ for bringing their assignment and for completing all of it, but not necessarily for the quality of the work. First, productivity, accuracy later. Early intervention. Decreases behavioral problems, really improves school grades, and also helps with social skills, which for the ADHD learner is just so important. Lifestyle changes. I love this slide. This is where, again, the social work perspective comes into play. Limiting screen time. I'm sure many of you parents can relate to the fact that when your kid sits in front of the iPod or the TV for an extended period of time, afterwards they're very dysregulated and even more difficult to re-engage. So limiting the exposure to that, using it as a reward, as a privilege. Sports and hobbies, so important. This was my most critical coping skill for dealing with my inattention, was having lacrosse practice and field hockey practice after school every day to go burn off my excess energy and prepare me to get started on homework. Bolstering organizational skills, perhaps an organizational tutor, showing them how you keep yourself organized, making it part of behavior plans, setting goals and attainable rewards, and then sticking to a daily routine. So the routine can be really important, again, for bolstering those skills that the ADHD learner is going to take with them throughout their life. So some tips. First, again, ADHD medicine may be requisite. Finding that coach or mentor who your child really connects with, who they trust, who they'll go along with the recommendations that they make. My next slide you'll see is a ADHD behavior report card, which many of you may know. It's a very simple behavior modification technique. I'll be transitioning to that here in a second, but using, again, that daily assignment sheet requiring teacher initials, possibly incorporating that into the use of a planner, so a planner that they have to get signed every day to make sure they've written down their assignments, completed their assignments, etc. And then again, I already talked a lot about this, the parent-teacher, parent-school liaison. This is a huge resource. Finding someone at the school who's on your child's team and they want to see your kid succeed, and they're going to help you put those supports in place. This is the behavior report card. I won't spend too much time here. Behavior modification programs can be really helpful for the ADHD learner. Again, thinking about rewards versus consequences and what they like more. So using a system like this for a couple weeks, making it more short-term, saying, hey, if you complete X assignments, attend all of your classes, have everything, you're prepared for classes for 2 weeks, you get a reward. Using a system like this to track it. Some school tips, extra sets of books. If your ADHD learner is forgetful, having an extra set of books at home eliminates that problem. Then they've got the school set, they've got the home set. Also, word processors for assignments. Some kids do better with the continuous note-taking, like writing them down, but some kids will respond more to having to type out their notes during the course of the class, or type out specific sort of assignments, things like that. Tape-recorded lectures requires a lot of effort. It's another thing that the ADHD kid has to sort of do, so I don't see this working quite as well, but for the auditory learner, the ADHD child who really responds to hearing and listening, this can be helpful. So Again, I love this idea of the planner. I think that this is difficult for some ADHD kids who forget things, but for some, having like a visual representation of everything that they need to do can be the key. Scheduling hard classes in the morning, or alternatively in the afternoon. Maybe you have an ADHD learner who's not a morning person and does better in the evening or in the afternoon. And then alternatively, alternating hard and easy classes throughout the day can be effective, just depending again on your individualized child. Basic accommodations that can be a part of an IEP or a 504 plan. The distraction-free setting, again, can be kind of difficult, but if you have a great school like McLean or Northstar Academy, this may be something that can be put in place. Interspersing breaks. Taking breaks is one of the primary coping skills that we teach at Northstar. The ADHD learner is going to have like real good attention for 20 minutes, and then they're going to need to get up and walk around. So providing an actual accommodation for that, like a pass that they can use to take a break. I love this one, permitting music during homework time. Again, some ADHD kids need silence, but some will be really engaged by having some instrumental music, so maybe classical music or just instruments can be really helpful for keeping them on task. And providing kind of like background noise as they're engaging in whatever they're doing. Written syllabus and handouts. Again, that's going to be specific on the environment that your learner is in, whether or not that can be provided. For some ADHD learners, that can be stressful, but for others, that can be a huge support. And I love the peer tutor idea. We do this a lot at Northstar, where we're going to be linking up two students during academics for tutoring purposes to keep each other accountable, and also to keep each other on track. The read, recite, write, review piece, that's not for every ADHD learner, but sometimes repetition and practice can be effective. We're now seeing some new research that suggests that ADHD kids don't necessarily benefit from practicing things over and over and over again, but in some cases, sort of that re-engagement and re-engagement and re-engagement in the material can be helpful for learning and retention. And like I said, the study buddy, I love this. I love the idea of the fallback classmate who your kid can call if they need to get a reminder about an assignment, borrow a book, get clarity on a question regarding an assignment. For each and every class that they're in, they should have the fallback classmate. Attending after school sessions, again, developing a strong relationship with teachers, with the ADHD school liaison, having someone in the school setting that your ADHD learner can go to and say, hey, I'm really struggling in this class, I need extra support, can you help me with this? Can be huge. And that's how I got through middle and high school, was by going to my teachers and developing relationships with them and having them understand me and what my needs were. And then finally, most importantly, this for me, extra time on tests was the difference between getting C's and getting A's, okay? I cannot express to you enough, if your kid refuses to take on every single accommodation, if they think it's stigmatizing, if they don't want to ask for help in class, please at least encourage them to use extended time on tests. This is so important for planning, for reviewing, for checking, for reducing anxiety around the test. This is requisite. So I believe that's my last slide. I am pleased to be here with my dad, Dr. Zametkin. He is a renowned psychiatrist in the field of ADHD. I think he's going to have an introduction, but I will say briefly that he's going to be giving you a psychiatry perspective. So the psychiatrist and the social worker perspective are very different, but equally important in the treatment of a child with ADHD. So he's going to go into a little bit more about that, but that's my section for today. Thank you guys so much.
Has anybody ever heard of this expression?
And you click that one to the next.
It's a tough act to follow. Okay, so am I ever going to follow Molly Zametkin ever again in my lecture career? Yeah, I probably will, but it is a tough act to follow. I am pleased to be here. I'm going to go very quickly. I've got a lot to cover. I got overexcited and interested in this subject of what are the effects of medication on learning and learning disabilities. So I kind of went overboard. So I'm going to give you a lot of material. if you're comfortable enough, how many people here have kids who take medication? Okay, so I think you might be interested in what I have to say. So I'm glad you're brave enough to raise your hand. It's a kind of a controversial thing to do, is to put your kid on medication, but you know, I've been holding the hands of Montgomery County parents for many, many years doing this. And let's just see if this button does it. Okay, that one didn't do it. Molly, it's the big button?
The like little side one.
I see, the side one, okay. All right. I'm going to review a whole bunch of different studies that really inform us about, do medications help learning and academic achievement? Because we certainly know that medications help behavior. And this is a very interesting study of 11,000 Dutch children asking the question, does the later start of medication impede academic progress in math and language arts? So remember, this is a population study, and it was a study of normal kids. I guess I can do this too here. This is a study of normal kids versus ADHD kids on medication. And it turns out that even though they're medicated, ADHD kids fall behind academically. And that's probably because 30% have learning disabilities. So the first take-home medicine is ADHD kids were more likely to decline academically, 72% in math and 42% in language arts. But the good news is, the earlier the medication was started, it mitigated the loss of academic achievement. Interesting little finding. All right. Now, you know, we've talked a lot about executive functioning, and to be very succinct about this, and I'll show you a slide later, executive functioning has all kinds of different problems, and there is this huge overlap between ADHD symptoms and executive functioning. And the point is that executive functioning is way beyond just ADHD. Most ADHD kids will have impulse control, will have self-monitoring problems, but they won't have many, many, many features which are traditionally associated with executive functioning. So I want to be very clear that, and the data I'll show you later, is that ADHD kids have 2 or 3 core features of executive functioning deficits, but they don't have 8 or 9 symptoms. And so it's complicated, it's controversial, and also just what is executive functioning is very complicated also. Now, it's interesting that...
Wait, you skipped one.
Okay, thanks, Mom.
There you go.
Okay. So what is the question is, do stimulants have any effect on executive functioning? And the question really is, what effect do stimulant medications have on all these components? And finding number 1 is, treated participants had significantly better writing. Treated participants had no difference from normals in generally executive functioning, verbal working memory, and quote, academics. This is kind of a surprising finding, because remember, ADHD has 2 or 3 components, but executive functioning can have 8 or 9 or 10. So, and the other thing is, does anybody do research with giving stimulants to kids if they don't have ADHD? And the answer is no, because it's a kind of a controversial thing to give stimulants for the wrong indications. Okay. Now, here's an interesting study, rapid improvement in grades following Ritalin in ADHD. This was a study done in Taiwan. The question was, what is the effect of methylphenidate on grades in ADHD? And they had 2 measures, math and Chinese. And the answer is that, let's go back. 61 to 66 had highly significant improvement in 1, mathematics, and 2, Chinese language. Those are large, significant differences, 0.004. Behavior improved, but there was no effect on neuropsychological functioning. So, and this was an open label design, which basically means it was not blinded. So, you know, it's interesting. I mean, this is a very interesting study.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, could you explain what neuropsychological...
Sure. Neuropsychological functioning is when you take your kid to get tested, they measure 20 or 30 different components of brain functioning, processing speed, working memory, a language, etc. So neuropsychological functioning is a composite of 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 measures of different parts of brain functioning. So taken here, it's kind of a catch-all, But in general, if you take all those tests together, there was no effect on the conglomerate of all that testing. Okay, and it's, you know, it's a flaw in the study, to be honest with you. All right, now here's an interesting study. How about college students? Do stimulants improve emotional memory in college students? Now, emotional memory, and these are kids with ADHD, okay? So stimulants do not improve academic achievement in undergraduates. And I'd like to make it very clear that we don't treat kids with stimulants for academic achievement. That is not an appropriate use. We treat kids for their behavior, so that they get positive behavior. So the whole discussion of, well, is it improving academic achievement or isn't, is in a way a little bit missing the point. We want well-adjusted kids with self-esteem, and we don't care if they get A's or B's. I mean, it's nice, they get more reinforcement if they get better grades. So this is not a deal breaker for kids going off to college, that it doesn't have any effect on academic achievement. Now, what this study was about was remembering things that had either emotional or neutral content. And so the question in this study was, does medication improve the recall of either emotional or non-emotional in ADHD kids? And the answer is all groups remember emotional content better than neutral, and that's been known for many, many years. Medicated ADHD kids remember more of both emotional and neutral content than unmedicated ADHD kids, and medicated ADHD kids have the same memory as control. So this is kind of one of these, hey, this is sort of good news. Reading and ADHD, I got very interested in this. Does ADHD meds affect reading? And you know, children with ADHD, and this is a study of children with ADHD plus reading disability. So this is not just purely reading disabled kids. And here's the answer. Ritalin in this study did enhance this composite conglomeration of things we call executive function. It improved, and remember, these are ADHD kids, not just general kids with executive functioning. It improved color naming, letter naming, speed, phonological decoding, and arithmetic computation. It had no impact on alphanumeric stimuli, which is vital in the role of word identification. Again, I'm not an expert on reading disabilities. And then there's a study, this Curl study, it increased reading outcome, reading a larger number of words. Now this should not be earth-shattering news that a kid with ADHD would have, who also has a reading disability, would have improvement in their difficulties. Because we know that these stimulants have profound effects on attention, concentration, focus, etc. But in this particular study, and this is what I was interested in, was reviewing the literature of what stimulants do to kids with learning disabilities. All right. Improved word and non-word decoding and rapid naming, provided preliminary support for the use of stimulants in the treatment of ADHD and reading disabled kids. And again, even if kids don't have a reading disability, stimulants have 5,000 research studies showing the effect of improvement on almost every measure except for long-term academic achievement in general. We'll get to that. There was one study of the non-stimulants, Stratera, which one study, non-significant, showed improved reading scores not accounted for by the reduction in ADHD, which is kind of interesting. So one could say, well, this is all due to reduction of ADHD, but in the study of Stratera, there is a study that showed that, in fact, there was improvement in reading scores, not as a function of changes in behavior. So, unanswered, apart from the effect of ADHD and executive functions, do medications improve reading in non-ADHD children? That study has not been done. As you can imagine, to get permission to study reading disabled kids who don't have ADHD with stimulant medications might be difficult. It's not impossible, and I think many people in this audience know that average, everyday, normal kids were studied at the NIH in the 1970s and shown to have the same response to stimulant medications as ADHD kids. So, you know, being a responder is in no way diagnostic of ADHD. Now, here's another study of the effect of Ritalin on reading. It's, again, unblinded, so we have to sort of take this a little bit, you know, with a little skepticism. There were 3 groups, the ADHD plus the dyslexic group, ADHD alone, and the dyslexia alone. And what was the result of this study? Ritalin improved reading the most in the ADHD plus the dyslexia group. The dyslexia alone did not show the improvement that the combined group showed. So this is the one and only study that I could find in reviewing the entire literature at looking at the effect of stimulants on reading disabilities.
Who's the author?
I'd have to get back to you on the author. I've got a pile of papers. I've never in my entire life read so many papers for a talk. And it's because I kind of got interested in this. I got carried away. So I would caution everybody to take the message away that, of course, because reading disability has its own neuroanatomy, neuroscience, etc., the chances of stimulant medications having an impact are small. But that should be the conclusion that you should take away. Now let's talk about math. I think math is very interesting for ADHD kids because math requires multiple steps. And if you miss one little step in a math problem, particularly as you get older, you get it all wrong. So math is a particularly vulnerable area for ADHD kids. Now in this particular study, 198 ADHD kids received both placebo and Ritalin. None were math disabled, okay, or learning disabled. The measures were this restricted academic activity scale and math performance. So remember, these were not kids who were chosen for math disability. And the results were math improved on Ritalin 0.001. That's a pretty profound difference. Okay, and once again, is it a specific effect on mathematic disability? No, because these kids didn't have math learning disability called dyscalculia. The other study was that just this RAS scale, which is generally just academic behavior, was highly correlated and with this improvement. So the Ritalin responders also had, in general, improvement in other academic areas. Ritalin improves math performance. It is not known if Ritalin improves performance in math-disabled students. Yes?
What is that P less than 0.001?
Yeah, okay, so let me quickly explain that, because I should have. That's a level of statistical significance. So a p-value is a very commonly used statistical. And something to be different from normal, let's say we want to measure the difference between the height of 4th graders and the height of 6th graders. Okay, that would be highly statistically significant at a p level. In general, in science, we have p less than 0.05 is significant. So the smaller that number is, the larger the difference is. So if a p-value is 0.001, it's, yes?
But an important point to add to that is that it doesn't speak to the size of the difference.
Say it a little
It
louder.
doesn't speak to the size of the difference.
Right,
It
right.
determines whether you could say that the difference you observe in your study could be generalized to the
Right,
population.
and that's an important point. So you can have a p001, but for example, if you measured the height of early birth 5th graders versus late birth 5th graders, but you had a sample size of 100,000, you would have a highly significant difference. Even though the difference in their height would be tiny, it would be highly significant because p-values are intimately tied into the sample size. When you have a small sample size, it's much harder to reach high levels of significance. But I'm glad you asked that, and if there's anything in here that's, because of the science, difficult, just please, jump right in. Okay.
Can we have a copy of these?
Can you have a copy of these slides? I'm going to have to think it over. I can't give you a yes or no right yet. Okay, this is the largest, most expensive study ever looking at academic achievement and the effect of medication versus medication plus psychosocial interventions. It's called the Multimodal Treatment Assessment, and it basically compared across country in 6 centers, medication by itself, medication plus the most gold standard additional resources, a classroom aid, a summer camp program, behavior parent training for the parents, et cetera, et cetera. And then the real control group was just kids were sent to their local pediatricians and treated. And this was a huge study. It resulted in 30 papers and has guided most of the current thinking. The current thinking in the treatment of ADHD is multimodal, which is basically medication plus all those other things. But the kind of shocking thing that came out of this study is that the medication accounted for about 90% of the improvement, which was not something that the people who are mostly psychologists and not physicians were not particularly happy to hear about. And so, in this huge debate that our society has about medicating these kids versus not medicating these kids, if you really scientifically, this is the study that really looked at it. And you know, there's not one good child psychiatrist who just gives out medicine and doesn't do parent education, parent training. I do a huge amount of behavior modification. I actually have kids put their parents on star charts. I mean, I literally have done that, where I have parents who can't get the hang of something, like yelling and screaming, and I have their 9-year-old kids giving them stars and star charts, you know, to get the parents to change their behavior, because, I mean, anybody who's good knows that you have to deal with parents. It works. Another thing about, I heard a comment a little earlier today about, there's a really brilliant paper by a guy named Russ Barkley, and behavior modification is very much more difficult in ADHD. And he wrote a paper called 18 Ways to Make a Token Economy More Successful. And the key is you got to change it a lot. You can't just, you know, put up a star chart on the fridge and leave it there for a month. You got to be constantly changing the reinforcers and the rewards. You got to keep the rewards really quick. And some kids, was alluded to earlier, it's really hard to find something that's reinforcing. One kid I saw yesterday, it turned out to be Beanie Boos. Has anybody ever heard of a Beanie Boo? Raise your hand, please. Okay, so guess what? I've never heard of Beanie Boos. The other thing that was fascinating, the other reinforcer for this kid, who is the most oppositional I've seen in years, was Friday Night Club. This kid was a member of some sort of club on Friday nights. And I said, well, look, you know, we don't restrict ADHD kids from sports, athletics, from anything that builds self-esteem. That's off the table, in my opinion, as far as how to do behavior mod with kids. But on the other hand, this kid only had 2 things that he was willing to work for. And I was thinking, well, we could build a program where if he can get 4 out of 5 check marks every day, he doesn't have to get 5 by the end of the week, you know, we can go. So anyways, I'm a big fan of behavior mod and not just medication alone, even though this slide might imply that. Okay, so no advantage for group 2, that's med plus psychosocial intervention and on academic measures. Okay, significant improvement seen across all groups. However, no children in the study had any learning disabilities. The psychosocial group included tutoring, organizational training, therapy, parent training, and social skills training. So it was a very comprehensive study. Again, a quick throwback to what is executive functioning. Inhibition, clearly an ADHD thing. Planning, very difficult for ADHD kids. Memory is not in any way, shape, or form mentioned in the DSM-5, which is our Bible for diagnosing things in psychiatry. Memory is not part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. Maybe it will someday. So the question is it, and Molly mentioned this, is EF functioning unique to ADHD? And the answer is absolutely not. Now, these are a series of studies that tell us how much executive functioning kids with ADHD have. Lisa Weinert, who wrote the first one, found that on average ADHD kids perform poorly on 2 of 6 executive function tests. Malone and Willicott, ADHD worse in memory and planning, organization, response, inhibition. Now these last 2 are what I consider the most profound parts of this talk, really. 31% of ADHD have 3 or more executive function symptoms. Only 10% of ADHD kids have 5 or more executive dysfunction symptoms. So I think this is, okay, this is, you know, kind of an interesting thing as you, I mean, I struggle with this issue of executive dysfunction and what I do. I know what I can treat, and I know what I have difficulty treating. Fortunately, at the Chesapeake ADD Center, where I've been working for the last few years, I'm surrounded by 6 or 7 neuropsychologists who deal with ADHD kids day in and day out. I'm the only physician, so I tend to get the kids who are really anxious, the kids who are depressed, and kids who have been tried on standard medicines and haven't done well. But, you know, I see everything under the sun. Okay, ADHD kids who do have a documented learning disability, which is documented by neuropsychologists, do have more executive function symptoms. And it's the same for adults. My little claim to fame was I was the first person ever to study the parents of ADHD kids. They had lower brain metabolism, and it was a big story in 1990, and God created adult ADHD, and as you know, it's kind of an epidemic these days. EF deficits are not uniformly characteristic of ADHD, nor are they unique to ADHD, and again, that's it. Ritalin executive function, does Ritalin improve executive function? In a study of African American children, who in fact are much less likely to get treatment. What the study showed was that in that study of the African American kids, Ritalin did enhance planning, precision, and persistence. I think I think I'm going to just stop here because I've been going on for 20 minutes, and I do want Molly, we're at 2:09 here. I mean, I've been talking for 20 minutes. We have till 12:30, just so you know. I guess I'll show 1 or 2 more slides, and then at 12:15 we'll stop, and then we'll have 15 minutes for question and answers. Okay, Concerta is Ritalin, for those of you who don't know. It's a short-acting Ritalin, and the question is, it delivers 3 doses a day. It does improve math fluency and accuracy, visual, spatial, working memory is improved, and all aspects of ADHD. It's kind of a breakthrough product because I tend to like the shorter acting medications. The extended releases don't really work as well, but what this Concerta does, which I have no financial interest in whatsoever, and by the way, I have no financial disclosures in this field at all, you know, what this delivery system does is administers 3 short-acting doses of Ritalin, no better than Adderall, but it's just a different delivery system.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to be very specific. So when you keep, you know, speaking of stimulants and medication, like you are very specific to Ritalin, not other forms of...
Right. So let me explain that. There's 2 levels of treatment, pharmacological treatment for ADHD. There's stimulants, which is Ritalin and Adderall's first cousin, Vyvanse. Those are the frontline medications that the vast majority of kids in the United States are on. There's been very, very little research on the tier 2 level drugs, which is Intuniv, Strattera, and Clonidine. And so I'm sort of forced to mostly talk about the stimulants because A, the safety and the efficacy has been 70 years in the making. So we have the safety and efficacy, but also the reason why investigators like to study those medications is because they have such a robust effect. The robustness of effect of Strattera and Intuniv and Clonidine is much, much lower. Now we call those second-line medications, but you know the side effects, which we always minimize, and I have yet to find a kid who I can't find, you know, I mean there are kids who fail medicines where they get side effects before they get benefits, and then that's a failure, you have to go on. And there are many kids who don't tolerate stimulant medications very well, and they do end up on steroids. But the problem is when you do literature research on the effect of medication on ADHD, and that's why there's only been 1 mention of Strattera in this, because there isn't any research on it. Okay, that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that. Stimulants students with ADHD demonstrated greater responsiveness to improved reading recognition of math calculations. Again, limited gains in literal reading comprehension. And executive functioning impairments response to Ritalin. And we heard a little bit about this earlier from Dr. Resnick. I think, is that her name, Dr. Resnick? Yeah. She talked about hot and cool symptoms, and I think this is really where I want to stop because it kind of gets complicated unless you went to her talk. But I think what I'd like to do is, you know, entertain any questions. We have 15 minutes, and these are supposed to be workshops. So, you know, I'm going to have Molly come up, and I appreciate your attention, and ask away. Yes.
I have a question for Molly. You said extra time on tests. You mentioned it as part of the thing. How do you get that at university level?
Really good question. So typically in order to get accommodations at a university level or in graduate school, a lot of the times they're looking for those supports to already be in place throughout high school or middle school. It can be really difficult to get them at the college level. When I went to graduate school, even though I had had accommodations throughout, literally since elementary school, they fought me on giving me accommodations in graduate school. So what it requires is significant self-advocacy. Going and talking to your counselor extensively, getting letters from your psychiatrist.
Previous reports are also really critical, and if your kid ever gets an IEP or 504, do not let anyone ever remove it, ever. Because, you know, if you have it, the documentation, some universities require fairly recent neuropsych testing, which can be very expensive. But, you know, many of you are going to be sort of thinking about where do I send my kid to college, and that's a really big question, is what is the student support? Well, I went to Colorado College, which was a small liberal arts school, and, you know, they were fantastic to work with. We're going to answer a lot of questions, so there's somebody right here, yeah.
What are your thoughts on the DNA testing in order to find out what the right medication
is? Right, the question is DNA testing for the right medication. I have had now 10 or 15 parents bring in these $1,000 reports of DNA testing to predict response to medication. And I was extremely skeptical because it's in the genome of the Zametkin Russian family to doubt everything. So I mean, we just are doubters, and again, being at the NIH and the Public Health Service. So I was just in New York 2 weeks ago, and they had a whole 3 hours discussion of this. It's not ready for prime time. Absolutely not ready. The only thing that DNA testing for either depression, anxiety, or stimulants, it'll predict side effects. Now, if you're like me, where you start with grains of sand sized doses of medicine and you get into side effects, okay, it's not the end of the world. To spend $1,000 to pick a medication that you're less or more likely. But this is going to take another 3 or 5 years, and the data that's been generated on this is all generated by the people who are making the test, and they won't let anybody look at it. The FDA has approved it because it's what's the word, reliable, it's valid, it tests what it tests, but it has not been proven to improve response to treatment. And depression is really where we need immediate response, because we have really depressed people. But that's a great question. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the side effects of, I've heard a lot of parents saying that their kids crash after it, and then they become really dysregulated?
Right. So there is a rebound from stimulant medication. And we warn parents the most common side effects are not eating lunch, staying up later at night, and if you overdose kids are flat and they're not themselves. They're just not happy kids. But there is also a rebound phenomenon. We can mitigate that if we're careful, and it's very easy to mitigate it. What you do is you give a very short-acting dose. Let's say you give Concerta. And at the end of the day, they come back and they're like wired and off the wall. And sometimes the crash is actually baseline. Sometimes it actually is worse than their baseline. So what you do is you just add tiny little bits of dose at the end of the day to smooth the coming off. But it's an ugly sight. It's not fun. And you know, that's a huge hole in our field of treating kids with stimulants, is that we can't treat them in the evening. Now, we do have clonidine, which puts them to sleep. We do have strattera and Intuniv. So there are sort of ways to kind of and you know, in the old days, I grew up in Rhode Island where Dexedrine was first used in 1937. Old-time pediatricians used to use Dexedrine to calm kids down in the evening. Now, we would never try that. But let's get to as many people as we can.
Okay, my question is, what do you think of medications during school days and no medications on the weekend? That's what my son has asked for.
So medication holidays is how we refer to that. I would say it can be helpful for some adolescents who have a lower level of impairment. For some adolescents or children not having medication on the weekend can lead to social difficulties, can lead to disorganization, things sort of going wrong on the weekends. I think you, the psychiatrist, would be and the doctor would be
Here's the bottom line. If a kid's going to get in trouble, or if a kid's going to take 6 hours to do 2 hours worth of homework, you treat them on Sunday or the day that it's totally as needed, the same way with the summer. If the kid's going to get thrown out of the swimming pool 6 times, he needs to be on medicine. If he's going to have a great summer, he's not going to boating camp, you know, he doesn't need it. So it's totally, I leave it up to the judgment of the parents.
Would you say that taking the holidays and the weekends improves the efficacy at the beginning of the week?
It may. It's, you know, it's like any medicine. We generally don't. We got a million questions, Mal, so let's go with you.
Yes, you mentioned earlier that the effects of the medication is prescribed earlier in the child's course. Can be helpful. What if the diagnosis is recent and the medications wouldn't be prescribed until mid to late adolescence?
So what's your question?
Is it still effective?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no question. You know, if you start medication in the 3rd grade, which is the most common year kids get diagnosed and treated, there's no difference. I mean, the data would say that they won't fall far behind, but, you know, living in this county, we deal with a lot of really bright kids who have ADHD, you know, and the academics isn't the issue. It's pissing everybody off in their lives is the issue. So it doesn't really matter when you start. I will give you a little word of warning, though, that I am highly skeptical about the diagnosis of ADHD being made for the first time in middle school. Okay, if any of you want to know if your kid had it, I would say let me or Molly read the comments from their teachers in K through 5. That's where we're looking for. Oh, he's listening so much better now, and he's doing this better, and he's doing that better. But the teachers, they take classes in how to write these nice backhanded compliments. You know? So I mean, that's where the goal is. What happens in middle school is that's when anxiety rears its ugly head, and depression. And just to make the point, this talk is not about that. There's huge overlap between depression and ADHD, and anxiety and ADHD. And half the kids who come to the Chesapeake ADHD Center have anxiety disorders in the white.
Actually, just to pick up on that very point, you mentioned you were in Dr. Resnick's talk, and one of the things that resonated with me, I'm the parent of a 6-year-old, is that emotions are the basis of motivation, and when you're feeling calm and safe, you're open to learning. My son, his anxiety goes off the charts. He's on Concerta, he was on Ritalin before, and it affects his ability to make friends. Then that affects his ability to listen in the classroom. So what do you do?
Okay, here's an interesting point. What do you do if, and again, because I was at NIH for 30 years, I do what's called a structured interview. Molly can do these in her sleep. But I will go through, if I evaluate a kid, I go through every symptom of ADHD, every symptom of an anxiety disorder, every symptom of depression, OCD, whatever. Then I grill you about what you were like as a kid and whether you haven't. So then I come to a decision. Does this kid have ADHD? Does he have ADHD and anxiety? And I got to tell you, being an expert, if you have a kid with both ADHD, who generally we think of as disinhibited, they're jumping off of roofs and whatever, and a kid who's really frightened and worried and can't go to birthday parties, you look for tics. You look for eye blinking, nose scrunching, and that, because this tic disorder, known as Tourette's, but it is so common. If I have a mom call me up and say, my kid's got ADHD, but he also has all this OCD stuff, it's almost like on the phone I say, well, what kind of tics does he have? And I've had physicians bring their kids in and say, oh, that's just a cold. He's always sniffing. It's the middle of the winter. There's no allergens. So great question, but we treat the anxiety separately. If it is really true that he has ADHD and he has anxiety, we treat them both. Yes?
A question about the stimulant medication and anxiety. If a child has pretty significant anxiety, is there any hesitation to give them a stimulant medication?
Here's the most fascinating thing I've learned by working at this Chesapeake ADD Center. Everybody thinks that stimulants are going to make you nervous because they're called stimulants. And they think they work by the same mechanism as caffeine. There couldn't be anything further from the truth. And I've always thought, well, they might make kids anxious. Well, I'll tell you something. I had a mom up in Columbia, one of my satellites, who came in for ADHD. She's highly functioning executive in late 40s. ADHD, great, put her on stimulants. She comes back a month later. She said, hey, I am really kicking it. I'm getting all this work done. I'm focusing. You solved all my problems. And by the way, I haven't worried about anything in the last month. Now, the question is that because she's getting all the work done? That's theory number one. Okay, I mean, I'm willing to buy a psychological theory. But then the question is it possible that this medicine has an anti-anxiety property? And the answer, now that I've seen this happen 7 or 8 times, is hell yeah. And that's why it may be overprescribed, because there are a lot of people come in and say, hey, I can't focus, I can't concentrate, and they get put on stimulant. And I had a guy come down from Harvard who was on every 90 minutes, like a huge dose of Ritalin. I took him off and he couldn't wake up for 2 days. He had an anxiety disorder. So that was a great question. Yes.
Okay, this is for Molly about because I'm more in the community-based portion of it, and I have a child. So my question is the daily planners, the daily reward charts. How are you augmenting those? How do you change those up? Because I set a chart, we'll do fine for a while, and then all hell goes. And it's like they, just like with Resnick, they've learned to accommodate that chart. So how do you tweak it? What are you looking for when you're looking for those motivators? Because I can't sometimes figure out what's going to trigger this, and I have 30 minutes, okay, till I need the next case management. So what are you looking for with these triggers?
So my dad sort of mentioned this, that it is really important to be changing them up because the sensitivity to rewards and consequences change. So on a day-to-day basis, the thing that was rewarding yesterday, today might not be as rewarding. That is a challenge. That can do, I would say, a couple things. First of all, being really communicative with the child about what they're currently motivated by. In the case where I do a lot of case management and I'm going from client to client all day, this can look like putting it sort of in the realm of the parenting. So putting it on them to modify it and to keep you posted on it. So when they have, this is the idea of the home contract versus the behavior contract at school. Maybe putting them together, making home and school expectations all in one, and being really communicative with parents about keeping them changing. But that's the battle.
It's a hard, Molly, give me all your cards. Give me your cards. I'm going to put some of Molly's cards out. But in a nutshell, it's really tough, okay? And what I tell people is behavior mod and having good parenting skills is essential. And part of my assessment is one of the scales I use is the cows come home scale. Do you ask your kid till the cows come home to do something? So that's one end of the scale. Or you're the military, you ask once or twice and then there's a consequence. So that's one way I evaluate parenting skills. The next one is, what do you do when you're getting non-compliance? And the third one is, do you cave in? You take something away and then you give it back. So we want parents to be, black belts in behavior model and parent training. With that said, guess what? Every day these kids are unmedicated after 3 or 4 or 5, and you've got to use the skills. And did you put some of your cards?
I have them right here.
All right, we'll put them out there.
They were out there. They were right there.
This is the comedy portion. Molly forbid me to tell any stories about her. So we managed to, we like to have humor. Yes.
So I am curious as to whether or not there's any scientific evidence of physical activity following the school day. You mentioned, and I'm totally with you, I don't think homework, especially in elementary school, my son is in 4th grade, has a lot of benefit because then he gets anxious about it and stresses out. My help with him, again, end of the day, is activity. If he is out playing baseball, if he is active, if I have to make him run up and down the steps, 10 times, it actually is a physical need for him to work that out. And is there any scientific study that supports
Can I take this?
Yes, go.
So when I went to college, I stopped doing extracurricular sports, and my grades suffered. And my mental health suffered. I started feeling crappy a lot. And then when I started working at NIH after college, I worked there for 4 years doing research, I started going to yoga every single day. And having that reward at the end of the day where I get through the whole day and then I have physical activity completely revamped my life. It brought my achievement back up, it brought my mental health back up, it completely reinvigorated me. So the science and the research absolutely supports the engagement in hobbies, activities, after-school sports, not just for burning off the excessive energy, but for the social implications, the rewards of being around people, learning those social cues, learning the value of working hard towards a goal, and the mental engagement of it. Proprioception, using your body, getting into your body at least once a day, having some physical activity that improves the communication between your brain and the rest of your body, and then also helps improve regulation.
In the way that.
When you're considering a new drug with your psychiatrist for your child, do you recommend beginning that new drug at the lowest dosage or at a point where they think there's an equivalent?
I'm going to say OMG, okay? And does everybody know what OMG is? Okay, I have an expression that I use with parents about how I dose kids. And I tell parents, whether it's an SSRI for an anxiety disorder, Prozac, whatever, I started a dose the size of a grain of salt. Now, is that small enough? Can anybody think of anything that's smaller than that? And guess what? You've got to do that. Why? Because kids who are between the ages of 5 and 10 need the highest dose of stimulants they'll ever need in their entire lives. And adults will need lower doses, and you will never, ever figure out how much a kid needs unless you start from the bottom and work up. And some kids you'll work up to 54 milligrams of Concerta, some kids you'll get only to 18. And so I'll be happy to talk to your physician, but and guess the other thing is, I tell parents, I'm going to do everything possible for your kid not to have side effects. I tell them they're going to not eat lunch. I can't do anything of that, but I got a scale here, and I'm going to track your kid's height and weight. I'm going to try and make sure your kid doesn't stay up later. And if he is up a little later, we're going to work on that. And I will not allow your kid to be flat and moody and a zombie kind of stuff. I mean, and my patients have my text. And I get texts all the time, and I call people back. But no, there is no dosing scheme. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just wondering, some of these studies about Ritalin, is there any difference or still any differences between Adderall and Ritalin?
The reason why Ritalin came up so much is because I did a PubMed on stimulants and learning disabilities. So the answer is, for whatever reason, because Adderall, just so you know, is dextroamphetamine. It was invented in 1937. And Ritalin really kind of came on the market in the early 50s. But for whatever reason, academics like to study stuff that has big effects. And guess what? Stimulants have big effects. So that's why there's so much research. And why there's more on Ritalin rather than dextroamphetamine. Adderall's a Johnny-come-lately, just so you know. It's a left and a right-hand version of dextroamphetamine. So that's why there's the least research on Adderall, just because it hasn't been done. But it doesn't mean it's not safe.
So outside of the research, though, for your opinion,
Of my opinion,
how would you choose between?
I would flip a coin, or very scientific, or if a mom, I am a huge advocate. You talk about genetic testing. You know what my genetic testing is? Who asked that question? Who asked the genetic? My genetic testing is, Mom, what were you like as a kid? Are you depressed or anxious? Dad, what were you? I want to know all about the aunts and uncles of this kid. And if anybody's had a positive response to anything, that's what the kid gets. Now, again, if they had a positive response to Prozac for depression, not. But if there's any, but usually there is not a family history for, but on the other hand, there's a lot of older brothers and sisters who have done well. And you know what else I've done, actually? I've treated adults who have done brilliantly, and then the moms bring the kid in, and the parents doing so well, I put the kid on the, you know, the kid on the mom's, and I've done the other thing where a kid's doing great and the mom comes in and I take the kid's response. I think they're opening the doors so you can run. But we're going to stay and take any other.